That's not what happened. The people didn't get dissatisfied with sodomy laws and then all of a sudden decided that they weren't going to enforce these laws anymore. There was a Supreme Court decision by the same boomer 1960 Supreme Court that found a right to an abortion in the Constitution. The same boomer Supreme Court that said that pornography was protected free speech. They said that there was a right to engage in sodomy protected by the Constitution. How are you a lawyer and don't know about this? Merry Christmas, everyone. You see, here at the Prosecution Channel, we're all about Christmas. I'm talking a traditional Christmas with eggnog, hanging out with your family, and worshiping the birth of Jesus Christ. None of that fake corporate consumerist Christmas crap. Nothing beats the traditional American Christmas. If you support Christmas, then I urge you to smash that like button and subscribe to this channel. Now, in honor of Christmas, I'd like to share my thoughts on this new Ben Shapiro porn movie. Now, we all know who Ben Shapiro is, right? Mr. Conservative, one of the members of the intellectual dark web. He's so deep in the dark web that you have to put in a lot of work to even just find his content. He definitely isn't some sort of stock character who the mainstream media likes to use to represent a conservative point of view. To really appreciate the intellectual dark web content that Ben Shapiro puts out there, you have to have a really big brain. You see, Ben Shapiro is some big-brained content. So let's see what a big-brain conservative thinks about pornography.
There are good scientific studies showing the effect of pornography on the human brain. It does have a drug-like effect on the human brain because there is a release of serotonin, because it does prompt certain brain activity that is addictive in nature. Pornography is indeed a major addiction problem, particularly for young men. It is enervating for the sex life. It is degrading to women. I wrote an entire book on pornography. It's my second book, all the way back in 2005, about the evils of pornography in American society. So I am very much on board with the idea that pornography is an evil.
Did you all hear that? Ben Shapiro is an expert on pornography. He wrote an entire book about the subject matter. And I'm certain that Ben Shapiro, in order to write that book, had to do a lot of research. I'm sure he had to watch a lot of pornographic material, for purposes of research for the book that he wrote about it. And as Ben Shapiro indicates, studies show that pornography is bad for men. It's degrading for women. Like Ben Shapiro says, it has similar properties to drugs. People can get addicted to pornography. So of course Ben Shapiro would want to ban pornography, right? If some company produced a consumer good that only had negative effects, that only provided a very superficial, unnecessary benefit with very negative consequences for the people who consume it, then that company shouldn't be allowed to operate anymore. Right, Ben Shapiro?
There's a big debate that is broken out among conservatives about how involved the government should be in regulating pornography. And the debate isn't really over pornography. The debate is really over what the role of government ought to be generally.
The debate about pornography isn't actually about pornography according to Ben Shapiro. It's actually about the role that the government ought to play generally. What a stupid thing to say. Well, that seems awfully vague, Ben Shapiro. It kind of seems like you're trying to weasel around to debate something else entirely without addressing any of the merits of whether pornography should be banned or not. I mean, you could say this to just about anything. The debate about gun control isn't actually about guns. It's about the role the government ought to play in society generally. The debate over abortion isn't actually about abortion. It's about the role that the government ought to play in society generally. What a stupid and pointless thing to say.
Many conservatives are arguing that the government ought to be engaged in promoting what they call the common good, and libertarians are arguing the government needs to completely stay out of this particular business. Now, I've been saying for pretty much my entire career that when it comes to matters governmental, I tend toward libertarianism, and when it comes to matters cultural, I'm very conservative.
So Ben Shapiro indicates that when it comes to cultural issues, he tends to side with the conservatives, not the libertarians. Pornography was something that was traditionally not permitted in society. It only became legal and commonplace when the boomer Supreme Court in the 1960s and 1970s declared that pornography was some sort of protected free speech. This was a big winner for people who were socially liberal and a loser for social conservatives. So for Ben Shapiro to have any legitimate claim to the title of social conservative, for him to be able to say, as he just did, that he is conservative on social issues, then almost certainly he would oppose pornography, right?
Right, so the entire presupposition of the founders is that you would have a moral and religious people, and if you're...
Okay, so Ben Shapiro establishes that the founding fathers did not form the United States with the expectation that it would simply be a place for individuals to pursue their rights. The expectation was that US citizens would be guided by morality and religious values. Since pretty much all religions are against pornography then, it stands to reason that the founding fathers would never have agreed that pornography is protected speech under the First Amendment of the US Constitution. Thanks for pointing this out, Ben.
Well, one of the things that has happened over the past 50 years is the complete fraying of that social fabric.
So in the last 50 years, the social fabric of the United States has been fraying. Well, what happened around 50 years ago? Oh yeah, it was the boomer Supreme Court that made up a bunch of restrictions and new rules. Like, for example, that pornography was protected free speech. Prior to that point, the Supreme Court didn't generally play a strong role in the lives of individual Americans. Judicial activism was frowned upon. But the boomer Supreme Court changed all of that. They told us that we have to tolerate pornography, and abortion, and a host of other issues. They dramatically reshaped how the United States was run as a country. A lot of these changes led to the destruction of the social fiber of this country.
Do you restore the culture, or do you simply do what the left would do and try and grab the commanding heights of government and then cram down from above? And I am firmly on the side of you have to grab the culture first.
But wait a minute, Ben Shapiro. Wasn't it Andrew Breitbart who said that culture flows downstream from politics? You used to work for Andrew Breitbart, right? So you should be familiar with this quote. So tell me, Ben Shapiro, what is your plan to culturally deal with the problem of pornography? But isn't that exactly what the Supreme Court did when it released judicial opinions reinterpreting pornography as protected free speech? Wasn't that a group of individuals in the government dictating to the entire country, to every town, city, and state in the union, that they were obligated to permit and allow the sale and consumption of pornography in their communities? How is that not an example of the federal government pushing a moral agenda on its citizens?
You're not operating in a world where you can simply grab the auspices of government and teach the people the right thing to do. Nor, by the way, do I think that it is moral to use the force of government to teach people the right thing to do.
But isn't that exactly what the Supreme Court did? It hammered down something that majority of the country didn't want, didn't agree with. Most Americans didn't think pornography should be allowed, and the Supreme Court said, you know what? Forget about this whole democracy thing. We're just going to tell you, you have to tolerate this in your community. It seems like Ben Shapiro's defense of pornography is actually the exact opposite. He's making the case as to why towns, cities, and communities should themselves have the ability to decide what's immoral and what's moral.
I think the argument starts at pornography, but very quickly it ends up in the realm of economics, where you have people like Tucker Carlson suggesting that it's the job of the government to promote the common good, economically speaking, which is starting to sound indistinguishable from Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren in a lot of ways.
So Ben Shapiro saying there's no difference between Tucker Carlson and socialists like Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren. That seems awfully strange to me. Has Ben Shapiro ever considered the possibility that it's him who's the odd man out? That perhaps his view of conservatism makes no sense? That in fact he's not a conservative at all, but actually a libertarian? I wonder if Ben Shapiro has ever thought about that.
And once you get to a common good government, what you're really talking about is a select few people who know best for the rest of us how exactly we ought to live our lives.
Wow, Ben Shapiro, you just made my case for me as to why a small number of Supreme Court justices shouldn't be able to dictate to every city and town in America that pornography must be tolerated, that towns have no choice but to allow porn to be sold there and consumed there.
The 2016 Republican Party platform stated that pornography, with its harmful effects, especially on children, has become a public health crisis that is destroying the lives of millions. And by the way, I agree with every word of that.
Wait a minute. So Ben Shapiro agrees that pornography is destroying the lives of millions of Americans, but he's going to tolerate it. He's going to defend the sale and consumption of pornography in this video purely on his political principles? I'm sorry, Ben Shapiro, but you more than anyone should be concerned with the idea that the government, because it wants to remain committed to a political ideology, is going to let millions of people be harmed. Can you think of any examples of that, Ben Shapiro, in history where a government stuck to an ideological position and millions of people ended up getting harmed? Here's an example. When Joseph Stalin was leader of the Soviet Union, he collectivized all of the agriculture so that the agriculture in the Soviet Union reflected communist ideology. He did this even though he knew that millions of people would starve to death. But Stalin didn't care. What he cared about was his political ideology. The harm to all of those people who starved to death, he couldn't give a shit about. Just like you said, you don't care if millions of people have their lives destroyed because of pornography. All of those people are just going to have to suffer, so that Ben Shapiro's ideal political philosophy can continue on unheeded.
Or is government there to protect rights that pre-existed government, particularly at the federal level? Is government there to protect rights that pre-exist government?
So Ben Shapiro talks about these rights that pre-exist government. If you read the Declaration of Independence, it talks about God-given rights. The idea is that these rights that we have under the US Constitution were given to us by God. That's why Ben Shapiro's conception of government makes absolutely zero sense. Pretty much everyone agrees, whether you're Jewish, Muslim, or Christian, that God would not approve of consuming pornography. Ben Shapiro has said as much multiple times in this video. So if we have all these constitutional rights given to us by God, how does it make any sense that one of those rights would be to consume pornography? Obviously, God did not give us that right because it would be inconsistent with what is taught by any of the three major Western religions.
Because in local government, you have a lot more room to move in terms of what the government can regulate. Why? Because people can move. Right? Once the federal government takes something over, then nobody has a choice anymore.
Oh, what a hypocrite. Come on, Ben Shapiro. You know the reason that pornography is legal in every single place in the United States is because the Supreme Court declared it constitutionally protected free speech. For you to get up there in this video and act like this is a problem that's better handled by local authorities is completely disingenuous. Whether pornography can be sold and consumed is something that should be decided on a local level. The Supreme Court had no business getting involved in something like this.
This is why there's a difference between the federal government and local governments. There's more homogeneity in local government. There's more generalized agreement in local government. And so you can more easily agree on how to regulate the public spaces.
Exactly, which is why local government should be the one to determine whether pornography is bought or sold there. The federal government shouldn't be involved in this debate at all. Like you literally just said, Ben Shapiro, if we let local governments handle this issue and a city makes pornography illegal and that's really important to you, for some reason you're a really shallow person that just likes to wank all the time, then maybe you'll move somewhere else where pornography is permitted. That would be a lot better approach than the Supreme Court just dictating to every town, community, and city in the country that pornography is here to stay and must be tolerated.
Right? As soon as the government is in the business of promoting the common good, the obvious question becomes, okay, and who defines the common good? Now, conservatives will say, well, the left's been doing this all along. Why shouldn't we do it? And the answer is because the left shouldn't be doing it.
Okay, so the left gains control of political power, and they use it to rig things to make sure that America's culture constantly goes in a left-wing direction. And that's exactly what's been happening. You start out with gays wanting civil unions, then you have gay marriage, then it's transgendered people. Now we're at the point where we need to have new genders invented to fit people. This is the reality of what's happening in this country. We constantly move in one direction, and it's because our so-called conservatives are people like Ben Shapiro, who just refuse to do anything. They just basically admit defeat at the start. Well, I don't like it when the left gains control of cultural institutions and uses it to push America further down one direction. So I'm just not going to do it at all. I'm just going to let it happen. And whenever a conservative gains control over the institution, I'm just going to tell them to do nothing.
This is not the role of government. The founders did not set up the government in order to, quote unquote, inculcate virtue, to promote virtue or the common good. The idea was that the Lockean idea behind the founding of the United States is that there were individual rights that pre-existed government, and government was enshrined at the federal level to protect those rights.
Ben Shapiro is dead wrong on this. First of all, the Bill of Rights was only supposed to apply to states originally, not individual people. We only started giving people individual rights through the Bill of Rights after the 14th Amendment was passed after the Civil War. And the reason that we did that is because the southern states were using its laws to basically harass and oppress black people. So there had to be the creation of some sort of individual right to protect the interest of black people who were hated by their state and local governments. The founding fathers never intended this when they founded the country. Ben Shapiro is also incorrect when he says that the founding fathers did not think virtue had any role to play in the government. And that's because Ben Shapiro doesn't understand his own political philosophy. He doesn't understand liberalism in the way that the founding fathers did. You see, during the era of the founding of America, most people strived to get what was called a liberal arts education. The conception of the liberal arts college was that people would go there and they would study either ancient Greek or Latin, and then they would read the great texts of Western civilization. I'm talking about stuff written by Plato, Aristotle, or St. Thomas Aquinas, these great Western philosophers. And you know what links these ancient Greeks together with these Catholic thinkers like St. Thomas Aquinas? They all believed in virtue theory and some concept of Stoicism. You see, how the founding fathers understood it, a good liberal was someone who could liberate themselves from all the things that were less important about living a human life. The idea was that someone would go into college as a young man concerned with things like having sex, eating food, and making money. And then they would read these great texts and they would realize that all of those things were not important. They would be liberated from that so they then could live virtuous lives. But in modern America, people have lost sight of that. And now people like Ben Shapiro believe that being a good liberal is allowing people to get focused on these baser desires, to get obsessed with making money, doing drugs, things like that. So the whole concept of liberalism has been completely bastardized by these people. Ben Shapiro advocates for a form of liberalism that values the complete opposite things that the founding fathers did.
If it were just about promoting the quote-unquote common good, why not have a monarchy? Why not have an aristocracy that decides? Why not have the Supreme Court simply decide all social policy in the United States?
Ben Shapiro, the issue is that the Supreme Court is dictating to the entire country what should be socially permitted and what shouldn't. It makes no sense to argue against a pornography ban by saying that you don't think a small number of government officials have any right to impose their moral values on the entire country, when that's exactly what happened when the Supreme Court, a small number of government officials, deemed pornography as protected free speech under the First Amendment and dictated morally to the entire country that it had to tolerate the sale and consumption of pornography. I thought you were in the intellectual dark web, Ben Shapiro. Why can't you seem to understand that your argument makes absolutely no sense?
It should be criminal to exploit women, and it is.
No, it's not, Ben Shapiro. Pornography is legal. All of these women depicted in all of these adult films, their sexuality is being exploited. Their sexual experiences with other people are being bought and sold as a consumer product. That's what legal pornography is, Ben Shapiro. Human sexuality should not be a consumer product. It's more important than that. It's more sacred than that. I can't believe I'm the one having to make this argument to supposedly conservative, religious, Orthodox Jew Ben Shapiro, that I have to point out to him that pornography is morally wrong, that it's exploitation. But he seems to not understand this.
It should be left to local principalities to determine how the public square works. If you live in a town and your town decides that it's going to be a porn-free town, that's their prerogative. There's no fundamental right that is invaded there.
Okay, if it should be left to local authorities, then wouldn't you agree, Ben Shapiro? Then those Supreme Court precedents that say that pornography is constitutionally protected free speech ought to be scrapped, and so those decisions can be made by localities rather than the federal government? That seems to be the logical conclusion to your argument, which makes no sense since you're arguing against a pornography ban.
The hardcore libertarians who say that pornography is protected by the First Amendment, the founders would have been shocked to discover that wood carvings of naked ladies would have been protected by the First Amendment. That's just nonsense. It's not true. Okay, the First Amendment was designed to protect political speech. It was not designed to protect obscenity. The Supreme Court has recognized as much. That's not just me. That's the entire history of the United States. Okay, but that's not what the argument is. What you're seeing is so-called conservatives, and they're conservative, but they're not conservative with regard to conserving the original founding purpose of government.
Wait a minute. So you earlier said that the founding fathers would not have conceived that pornography would be protected speech under the First Amendment. And in fact, you indicated that the founding fathers' intent behind the First Amendment was to protect political speech, not to protect pornography. Then just a few minutes later, you say that pornography cannot be banned because the original intent of the founders. So which is it, Ben Shapiro? Again, these statements are inconsistent with each other. Did the founding fathers' original intent of the First Amendment was just to protect political speech and not pornography? Or was their original intent to protect pornography? Because you seem to be making both of these arguments, even though they conflict with one another.
And I am not in the business of the government doing what's best for you and reshaping you as an individual moral human being. That's for your church, that's for your family, that's for your social fabric. That is not for the government to do.
Ben Shapiro, you argued yourself earlier in this video that America's social fabric has been decimated at this point. These institutions you're talking about, the social fabric, the churches, the family, these are all things that are in decline in the United States. It's not all too surprising given the fact that we allow so much immigration into our country of people who aren't Christians, who don't have the same social values that Americans traditionally had. And who's the person who's advocating for all of this immigration all the time? It's you, Ben Shapiro. You're constantly talking about how America needs all of this legal immigration, but a lot of the people coming aren't Christians. So how is the church supposed to solve the problem of immorality of the population? How can we expect the church to deal with the issue of pornography, which you just said earlier in the video is destroying the lives of millions of people? Your answer of doing nothing doesn't address the problem. It just allows it to get worse and worse. It's a weak, impotent response to a problem such as this.
I think the government had a perfect right to step in and stop states from enshrining segregation. But I have serious problems with the aspects of the Civil Rights Act that dictate that private businesses ought to be prosecuted for discrimination. Why? Because they're private businesses.
Now, I have my own issues with the Civil Rights Act, and I did a video on that. If you want to know more on that, you can watch that video. I forget the name of it offhand. But I don't understand Ben Shapiro's argument here. How could the federal government have possibly ended segregation in the South if it didn't have the ability to prosecute businesses for failing to integrate people? So if you were a real estate agent and a black person wanted to buy a house in the white part of town and you refused, there would be nothing that the federal government could do at that point. Same thing if you were a hotel that was in the white part of town and you refused to rent a room to a black. If the government couldn't prosecute you for it, if there was no penalty, then what's to stop you from doing it?
You have a right to do wrong in the United States, things that are bad. You have a right to do. And then presumably you go out of business. I mean, that would be the hope. The hope is that you then go out of business if you discriminate, for example.
Here's how Ben Shapiro would have solved segregation, everyone. He would have done absolutely nothing. I'm sure the status quo would just change on its own. That makes a lot of sense, right?
Matt Walsh, who writes for us over at Daily Wire, he says, we say we're conservatives. What the hell are we trying to conserve?
Yeah, it seems like you and Matt Walsh, your employee who works for you at the Daily Wire, you guys are pretty much useless at conserving anything.
Within 5 years of gay marriage being approved, we have drag kids, drag queen story hour, adults dancing with children at pride parades naked, decriminalization of AIDS transmission, kids being chemically castrated by the state, men competing in women's events, and Desmond is Amazing going on Good Morning America. How long do you think it is before Turning Point USA or other conservative organizations start hosting their own conservative drag queen story hours? In other words, how long is it before corporate or conservative Inc., mainstream conservatism becomes effectively left-wing?
Okay. I can't speak to Turning Point USA or what their plans are. I have a feeling that drag shows probably aren't in their plans, so I wouldn't worry too much about that. But in terms of, generally speaking, conservatives embracing this sort of thing, and what you're talking about is more than anything the abuse of children, the sexual abuse of children. In terms of conservatives embracing that, so-called conservatives embracing it, it seems that the pattern is that conservatives generally will object to something, and then it happens anyway, and then within 10 years, most so-called conservatives are saying, yeah, that's okay. Right. And so I would say, generally speaking, I think that 10 years from now, probably there will be a lot of conservatives defending it, or at least saying that it's okay and we shouldn't interfere. Unfortunately, I think that's the pattern.
This is why, again, localism is a great thing. Subsidiarity, localism, it's a wonderful, wonderful thing, because you get local governments where more people agree. And there, you don't have to worry so much about cramming down on people who disagree because, of course, they are all local and they can leave.
You go on and on about how localism is a great thing, but you're defending a policy that was implemented by the Supreme Court, forcing every local community in the entire country to tolerate the sale and consumption of pornography. How is that consistent with your strong belief in localism? How is that consistent with the Founding Fathers' vision of the United States as a federalist country where different localities could have their own rules and where experimentation could take place? Earlier in the video, you said that millions of people's lives were going to be destroyed by pornography. Doesn't this seem like something that we would want different states to try different things with to find out what works best? Instead, you defend a blanket ban by the Supreme Court that indicates pornography must be tolerated everywhere.
You're seeing is a crossover between the so-called common good conservatives on pornography and common good conservatives on economics, who say that it's time to regulate the free market economy, make the market work for us.
Well, when income inequality is out of control, when people aren't forming families anymore, when the birth rate has plummeted, when millennials and Generation Z can't afford to buy houses or pay for education, well, yeah, it seems like there are things that need to change. It seems like that status quo is unacceptable to most Americans. It seems like the free market isn't going to magically work out these problems because the same problems have been going on for decades. When the people running conservative movements in the United States, like Ben Shapiro, seem to take the approach of, well, there's nothing we can do to solve these problems. It's not the role of the government. Churches are supposed to solve these problems even though there's no way that they can. Then people start to believe that they're not listening to a real conservative. They start to expect that the people leading the conservative movement are nothing but a bunch of grifters.
Is politics upstream of culture or is politics downstream of culture? So one of my mentors, Andrew Breitbart, was famous for saying that politics is downstream of culture. In other words, the country changes culturally and then the law changes to reflect the country's culture. And this is obviously true.
Oh, so you do know about the quote then. So why earlier did you suggest the opposite, Ben Shapiro?
Right? If the law is promoting something that the people do not believe in, then the law eventually becomes non-enforced and then just dies. That's what happened, for example, with regard to sodomy laws, to take an example. So for hundreds of years in America, there were sodomy laws on the books, and then the American people were like, really, we're not going to enforce this stuff. Like, this is none of our business, what people do behind closed doors. And then the laws were non-enforced, but on the books. And there were cultural conservatives saying, well, you know, those laws, they're important. They should remain, just to show that we don't like this kind of activity.
Are you kidding me? Ben Shapiro, that's not what happened. The people didn't get dissatisfied with sodomy laws and then all of a sudden decided that they weren't going to enforce these laws anymore. There was a Supreme Court decision by the same Supreme Court that found a right to an abortion in the Constitution. The same boomer Supreme Court that said that pornography was protected free speech. They said that there was a right to engage in sodomy protected by the Constitution. How are you a lawyer and don't know about this? How are you this stupid? I can't believe you just got and broadcast to thousands of people and indicated that the reason sodomy laws were changed in the United States was because people got tired of them and just stopped enforcing them. That's historically wrong. Ben Shapiro has no idea what he's talking about in regards to this subject. He never should have gotten involved in this debate. For someone who wrote a book about pornography, he seems to be unaware of the fact that pornography became legal based on a Supreme Court decision. He seems to just not know that. This is the guy who's supposed to be the head of the intellectual dark web. You've got to be fucking kidding me.
What I mean is that the government is not your moral teacher. And as a religious person, if you believe that the government is your moral teacher, I wonder about the status of your actual religious belief. I don't trust the government to be my moral teacher. You think?
I very much disagree with Ben Shapiro. I think it's important for our schools to teach moral values to children. They're some of the most important things that should be taught. In the United States, we're all supposed to be citizens of a democratic republic. Yet when we teach our kids in school, we give them absolutely no information as to how to become good, informed citizens. We should be teaching our children about local politics, about things going on in city, state, county, national politics. They should be educated on this issue. They should know about town council meetings going on. They should be aware of how their local economy works. This is all stuff that's very important that should be taught to anyone who's going to eventually become a citizen of a democratic republic. Instead, the state of public schools in America is absolutely atrocious. We don't teach children anything about citizenship. What our schools do is they create winners and losers. They rank students according to IQ and credential them. This allows big companies and banks that operate out of the winner cities like San Francisco, New York, Seattle, places like that, to swoop over the country like vultures and take any person in any loser city or town who happens to be talented and basically steals that person to work away for some sort of bank or corporation for the rest of their life in one of the winning cities. It's absolutely disgusting, but that's how education works today. It serves the interests of corporate America and banks, not of the country itself, which needs people who are educated democratic citizens. That's why our state, local, and county politics are so neglected and so able to be caught up by special interests in corporations who gain control of these local institutions and then rent-seek off the taxpayers. It's endemic to the United States. Ben Shapiro is supposed to be this guy who believes in competitive free marketplace, in capitalism, but the sort of thing that he defends in this video is the exact opposite of that. It's crony capitalism, it's corruption, and it's inefficient fake capitalism.
Like there's this weird divide among people on the right where they're like, well, this is the last election that ever matters. It's Flight 93 election. Right? This is the last election. It doesn't, after this, if we don't win, it's all over.
Well, Ben Shapiro, because of decades of legal immigration of the sort that you constantly defend and advocate for, the demographics of the United States have been changing. The majority of these immigrants and their children don't vote for conservatives. We're approaching a point where Texas is going to turn blue. And when that happens, no conservative will get elected president again for at least possibly 100 years, if not ever. This is why the culture war is so intense right now. If conservatives don't do everything they can to cut that spigot off, then conservatism in the United States is doomed. You just ignoring this issue and getting up there and saying like, well, I don't out of principle think the government should be involved in making these sorts of decisions is only making the problem worse. It's again, another sign of impotence and weakness.
Is this your last chance ever? And if it is your last chance ever, then do you really believe that you promoting the quote unquote common good, your version of the common good, that's gonna last for 5 minutes beyond your term?
Well, Lyndon B. Johnson, when he was president in the 70s, passed the Great Society programs as part of his war on poverty. These were things that gave Americans entitlements to things like food stamps, Section 8 housing, and a plethora of other welfare benefits. These things are very unpopular with conservatives. A lot of conservatives criticize these programs because the poverty rate has not gone down at all as a result of any of these programs. Since Lyndon Johnson's presidency ended, the presidency has several times changed over to Republicans. The Republicans have also controlled Congress at multiple points since these programs were passed. Yet all of them still exist to today. None of them were ever ended. This argument by Ben Shapiro that conservatives shouldn't pass any legislation or try to address any problems the country has because another new administration might reverse whatever they did is pathetic and weak. It's a defeatist opinion to have. Well, why bother doing anything? Because somewhere down the line, someone else could undo what I did. The reason why the conservative movement has been so ineffective in the United States for so many years is because its leaders, people like Ben Shapiro, are gutless cowards who don't want to bother to do anything. They're the laziest people on earth. They're absolute grifters.
The answer is that if you actually want a serious culture shift in America, you have to make it a culture shift. It can't just be a government shift.
The problem with the culture shift is that America doesn't have a culture anymore. Don't believe me? Okay, explain to me what the culture of Seattle, Washington is. What is the culture of Arizona? Explain to me the culture of Denver, Colorado. Good luck answering any of those questions. America no longer has a culture. It's a place where individual people pursue their own individual interests, where every single city and state looks the same. People going to Walmart, eating at Chipotle, consuming things.
I reject this idea of dual loyalty. I have loyalty to ideas. And of course I love the Grand Canyon, I love the Rocky Mountains, and I love Boston, and I love Chicago. But if all that disappeared and all I had was ideas, and we were on an island, that's America, that's Israel. And that's what people have to realize, that America's just a placeholder for timeless ideas. And if you fall too in love with, the specific place and all this, that's not what it is. Israel will be the exception because there is a holy connection to this land.
I mean, the United States used to have distinct cultures. You think of historic New Orleans and how different that was from Charleston, South Carolina, or New York City. That's because we used to have actual real cultures, but we don't anymore. And if there's no culture, there's no way for anyone to affect any sort of cultural change that'll address problems like those caused by pornography.
So if you're saying that Drag Queen Story Hour should be banned because you believe that Drag Queen Story Hour is damaging to children, and you're not making the case, right? You're not bringing a sociological case, a secularly based case. You're basically just saying, I don't like drag queens, and therefore Drag Queen Story Hour is banned. Okay, and you're doing that at the federal level.
But that's exactly what you're defending, Ben Shapiro. It used to be the case that local governments decided whether or not pornography would be permitted in their communities. And it was the federal government through the Supreme Court who took away that control and indicated that every city and town in every state had to permit the sale and consumption of pornography. The argument you are making is completely reversed. But Ben Shapiro, you don't understand. That's what the socially liberal people are doing. At the federal level, the boomer Supreme Court during the 1960s forced all local communities to tolerate pornography. The conservatives who are opposed to drag time story hour for kids aren't trying to ban it on the federal level. They're trying to ban it in their local communities, and they're having problems because of all of these federal discrimination laws and things like that. What we need is a return to localism. Localities should be able to have their own independent cultures, their own independent laws. That's what the founding fathers wanted. That was the whole point of federalism. We need to get the Supreme Court out of the business of what all of these individual people in small local communities are doing. But you don't understand that. You get this wrong again and again and again in this video. And at this point, that's about all I have to say on the issue. Again, we at the Prosecution Channel here are strong supporters of Christmas. If you want to support Christmas too, go ahead and leave a like on the video. Go ahead and subscribe to my channel. If you're not already subscribed, feel free to leave a comment. And once again, Merry Christmas. Thank you.